My name is Lee Carrick, and I'm going to be taking you through a relatively short presentation today about Reading Plus and kind of focusing on Reading Plus and how it helps EAL students in the UK school system. So just to give you guys a little bit of background about me, I am a former EAL teacher. I taught English in Taiwan for about 10 years in the Taiwan immersion system. While I was teaching in Taiwan, I taught students from Key Stage 1 all the way up to post secondary. I've taught for 10 years in EAL. I've also been on the other side of that, learning a language myself. But I also kind of live a little bit of an EAL world. My wife speaks English as a second language. My son is growing up bilingual. So I have quite a lot of experience in this kind of world in EAL. For the past 3 years, I've been working with Reading Plus in the English school system. So I've worked with hundreds of schools over the past 3 years, a lot of them with very, very high percentage EAL students. When we're talking about some of the schools in the inner cities in the UK, we're talking about schools that often have as much as 90% EAL students. So significant portions of EAL students. I thought it might be a good idea. It might be incredibly boring, but I thought it might be a good idea just to give you guys an idea of what an immersion school would look like. And I think that's quite important to put into context in terms of how difficult it is, the challenges that we face when working with a large percentage of EAL students in our schools. So if you work in the immersion system in Taiwan and across Asia in general, you have a lot of time with your students. So my Key Stage 1 students, they came into my class for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. They had 15 hours of explicit instruction from me just to help them develop their English. From Key Stage 2, from when they finish Key Stage 1, move into Key Stage 2, they're still in class 6 hours per week. From Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, it's 2 to 4 hours a week. So they start off in our school at Key Stage 1, go all the way through to post-secondary. And by the time they get to that, they're fluent English speakers. Obviously, in the English system, we don't have these immersion style schools. What we have is our English curriculum to follow. And these students are coming into the curriculum and have to just pick it up as best they can. They're not going to have a lot of time where they're being kind of explicitly taught English as an additional or as a second language. And I think where that fits in with Reading Plus is not just Reading Plus, but we have to be able to utilize all of the tools that are available to us as teachers to help these students when they're coming into the English system. And one of the things I've been doing for the past 3 years with Reading Plus is working with these high percentage EAL schools or working with schools where the program is used for an EAL intervention. So what do we mean by EAL? It's quite a broad term inside the UK, if I'm honest. It's anybody whose parents or anybody who doesn't speak English as their first language when they go home. And obviously you guys listening to this will know as well as I do, that could mean somebody who's actually a fluent English speaker and a fluent reader of English as well. It might be somebody who was born in the UK and has grown up speaking English, but when they go home, of course, they're speaking as we do in this house, speaking Chinese, or they're speaking Arabic, or they're speaking Ukrainian or something like that. At the other end of the spectrum, what we have are students who are coming into the English school system, having recently arrived in the country. In the past few years, I've spoken to a lot of schools who have a lot of Ukrainian children, for example, or students who speak Cantonese as a first language coming from Hong Kong or other parts of southern China as well. So the range that we're talking about for EAL students is vast. And we'll talk about how the program helps those students who are at different stages in their English language development. One of the things to note is in terms of the studies that have been done on attainment for EAL students, by the time they get to the end of primary school, they're 10 months behind where their peers are on average. By the time they get to the end of secondary school, they're basically on average a year behind where their peers are. And Reading Plus will be able to help with students who are very much at the beginning of their English language development, students who are in the country for a few years and can speak English relatively well but need some catch up, and even students who are fluent English speakers who we want to help stretch and challenge. The program can do that as well. Okay, so a little bit of an overview of what Reading Plus is, and then we'll continue this conversation as we go through the PowerPoint presentation. So Reading Plus is an online reading development program that is going to begin with a diagnostic reading assessment so that the students are placed at an appropriate starting point for them as individuals on the program, very much a bespoke reading development program. The purpose and the design of Reading Plus is to help students develop their silent reading fluency, their comprehension, their vocabulary, and their reading stamina, with the intention to create and help students develop overall reading proficiency. For EAL students, what you have is a program which will start them off at an appropriate starting point for their reading development, rather than just looking at how old they are or what year they're in at school and starting them at that point. To give you an example of what that might look like, if we're talking about somebody, say, for example, who is a year 7 student who has recently started learning English, if they say, for example, have a reading proficiency of a year 2 student, one of the difficulties you have when you're teaching English, and one of the difficulties that I had when I was teaching English, was finding texts and books that were appropriate in terms of the complexity, but also engaging in terms of the content. And what Reading Plus will provide to these students is content appropriate, complexity appropriate texts. So your year 7 student reading at a year 2 level will be able to access the texts, but also not feel embarrassed or condescended to by the content of the texts, because they will be written for somebody who's in secondary school. It provides for EAL students a bespoke one-to-one reading development process that they can do in kind of quote unquote a safe space. They're not going to be in a room surrounded by their peers listening to them read. They're not going to feel embarrassed by what they're reading, and the program provides that to them by providing them with bespoke texts as well. One of the things that I've kind of written down in my notes here is a kind of a guideline in terms of how to develop their reading. The first thing that I'd written down was time on task. So helping these EAL students develop their reading, we're going to target them with reading 5 stories per week. And that's going to take between 60 and 90 minutes per week, usually broken down into small chunks, so 15, 20 minutes at a time on there. The second thing is the content and complexity of these stories, which I've already mentioned, will meet the needs of the individual students. And then what the program provides is extrinsic and intrinsic motivators to want to read. The extrinsic motivation are things like hitting targets and getting awards and getting certificates and leveling up and getting achievements. And the intrinsic motivation to read, obviously, is the enjoyment of reading itself. And by giving the students access to a large bank of complexity appropriate, content appropriate stories, and then allowing those students to choose what text they read rather than forcing them to read a text that they don't want to, that gives the intrinsic motivation to want to get onto Reading Plus and continue reading. And obviously, when they see that positive reinforcement coming back and that praise, not only from the program, but from their teachers, hopefully that will make them want to read not only on Reading Plus, but eventually picking up books and reading for pleasure as well. When the students have finished that insight assessment, they will be given access to their first library of texts. That library of text will be appropriately leveled for that student based on what they need at the time. So is it fluency development that is their current focus, or is it comprehension development that is their current focus? And that will change the library that they go into. When students enter into these libraries, what they will be given is approximately 80 texts to choose from per library, which is more than they would ever need to complete a single library. And inside those libraries, you're going to have a range of fiction and non-fiction from a broad range of subjects and genres. So you will have stories on there about Lionel Messi, for example, or The Rock, or people from popular culture. But you'll also have stories in there, for example, about Shakespeare's early childhood, or stories, classic stories, like things like Call of the Wild, Jack London stories, etc., as well. The most important thing about the libraries is that the content of these libraries is of high interest and deliberately written to entertain and engage students. And as I said previously, because they're able to choose what they want to read themselves rather than being forced to read something, it tends to make them want to read more. Um, one of the uh, one of the things that I learned not only teaching English but also learning a second language is that novelty is incredibly important when it comes to reading. So reading lots and lots of different texts regularly increases and rapidly increases the speed at which students can learn vocabulary, for example. So when we're kind of looking at polyglots, one of the strategies that a polyglot will use to quickly develop their language acquisition is that they will read short stories repeatedly. And what that allows them to do is to see the vocabulary that they're trying to learn in lots of different contexts. There's a gentleman called Ollie Richards who I used when I was learning Chinese. He's one of the main advocates for this, and this was what Reading Plus is excellent at doing. So your students are reading 5 completely different stories every single week about 5 very different subjects potentially in English at an appropriate level in terms of the complexity of the vocabulary, the sentence length, the grammar, the total word count of the story, etc. And what it allows them to do is to very, very quickly start to see high frequency vocabulary, target vocabulary repeatedly over time in different contexts. They, yeah, it also is excellent at helping them develop cultural context because they're going to be reading from a very, very wide range of subjects, whether it's Indian history or Chinese culture or American history or sports and that kind of thing. It also allows students to really quite quickly develop that cultural context, but more importantly, at a level that is appropriate for them at their own pace as well. So in total, there's about 1,400 stories on the program, more than students would ever need to be able to read, but lots in there for them to choose from. The insight assessment, the reading diagnostic assessment will decide where they place. And from that point forward, the computer adaptive learning on the program will decide how long students need to spend in these libraries. To give you guys an idea of the breadth of Reading Plus, the first library on the program is a level called Pre-A. That's a beginning of year 2 level complexity library. By the time they get to the end of Reading Plus, they're reading texts that are suitable for Key Stage 5 students. So suitable for students reading at a Key Stage 2, a Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, and the final library is a further education library for them on there as well. Okay, so there's a couple of strategies built into Reading Plus to help your students develop their reading stamina, something which is going to be key for students who are learning to read English or any language for that matter. How the program does that is start them off with a very low word count when they're on the lower levels of the program. They'll be, for your kind of really low readability students, they could be reading texts that are as little as 300 to 500 words long. So these stories are complete stories. They're not extracts, which means the students still get that satisfaction from reading a complete story, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then being able to complete comprehension questions at the end of it. The word count will gradually increase as they move through the program. By the time they get up to the end of Key Stage 2, they're reading texts that are approximately 2,000 words long, which is obviously appropriate for the word count of the SATs paper. And then as they get into Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, they start to read texts up to 4,000 words long. While they're reading these texts, the program will also gradually increase the amount that they're reading before they get a break from the plain text on Reading Plus. What a break would look like is what's called an engagement builder, which is really just an image related to the story. So students, very much at the beginning of their time learning English, they'll be reading maybe a half a page, maybe a page before they get a break. By the time they get through to their proficiency level for their age, they're reading half of a story before they get a break on the program as well. Um, okay, so vocabulary, obviously an incredibly important function in terms of what the program does and key to the success of the students. There's two different ways in which Reading Plus is going to help your EAL students to develop their English vocabulary. The first way is by free reading on the reading portion of the program, and the second way is through explicit vocabulary instruction. There was a study, and I've had to write this down, forgive me, because I would have forgotten, in 2019 by Macquarie, which essentially showed that if you could only teach students one way of learning vocabulary, you'd be better off teaching them vocabulary through free reading and understanding the words in context by being able to infer meaning from the context of a sentence. With Reading Plus, the stories are specifically written for us, and that's one of the ways that we can control the content complexity dichotomy. But it's also the way in which we can control where target vocabulary sits inside these stories and how much target vocabulary sits inside these stories. So the students, while reading, are reading sentences that are very context rich, so that when they read a word or see a word that they might not know, surrounded by high frequency words that they probably would know, they can start to infer what that meaning is, and they'll see it repeatedly through a story. So they're not always having to stop, putting their hand up, asking you what a word means, or copying, pasting it into Google and translating it into their first language, which I've seen happen in schools in the UK. They can just free read for meaning, read for pleasure, read for understanding. With Reading Plus, that's the strategy that the program employs through the texts. But it also has explicit vocabulary instruction as well. So these vocabulary lessons, which you can see on the screen now, look like this. They're there to teach Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary through the program. They're also designed to teach students automaticity and instant recognition of words. So while they're learning the vocab on Reading Plus, they're encouraged to read automatically, to read with instant recognition rather than leaning on their phonics and their decoding. The reason for that is we're looking to help them make that gap or bridge that gap between phonics and fluent reading. As with the reading portion of Reading Plus, the vocab starts at year 2 and goes through to the end of Key Stage 4. They'll be doing vocabulary lessons less than their reading lessons for the most part, but it is available to them. I've worked with quite a lot of schools where the EAL students that they are concerned about are not quite ready to be reading 5 stories a week at a year 2 level, but they are on the cusp of leaving phonics and going into fluent reading. So for those students, if it was appropriate to do so, we could increase the number of explicit vocabulary lessons that they're taking, temporarily decrease the number of reading lessons that they're doing, and over time change and build up the reading lessons and bring down the explicit vocabulary lessons. Because as I said, what we're looking to do is to have them free read stories so that they can interpret what the meaning of the word is without checking dictionaries and so on and so forth. Also, something that I learned when I was teaching English and when I was learning Chinese in Taiwan is that you will remember a lot more vocabulary from free reading than you will by checking the dictionary and looking for the meaning of that word in your native language as well. Okay, so with the comprehension side of Reading Plus, what the students will do at the end of every single story that they read is they will answer 10 comprehension questions. The comprehension questions that they are answering are based around the reading domains that they need to learn. So the exposure that they're given to different kinds of comprehension questions depends on what level that they're working at. So if you do, say, for example, have an EAL student who's in year 9 but working at a year 4 level in terms of their readability, the program understands that their readability is at a year 4 level. and will expose them to a higher percentage of questions that would be suitable for somebody working at Key Stage 2. So what that means is they're going to see a high percentage of inference questions, retrieval questions, vocabulary questions, summarizing questions, some sequencing of events questions as well. So the comprehension questions is also related to the level that they're working at, rather than how old they are or what year that they're in school. And as they move through the program, as they move through levels of complexity, the program, using again that computer adaptive learning, automatically changes the exposure that they get to different kinds of comprehension questions, so that when they make it up to Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, they're seeing a higher percentage of authorial choice questions, authorial tone questions, interpreting image questions, and so on. And what this provides to you as educators is a skills gap analysis report, so that you guys can see not only kind of what exposure they're having to different kinds of questions, but to what extent they're having success answering these questions. And if they're not having success answering these questions, the program has inbuilt paper-based interventions to help them develop inference or retrieval or vocabulary at a level which is suitable for their current readability. One of the kind of ways that the program was designed is that the students are reading a story, but they know at the end of that story they've got 10 comprehension questions to answer. And when they answer these questions and they do well, they get a lot of positive reinforcement through certificates and awards and achievements, etc., which encourages the students to read more closely when they are reading these stories on Reading Plus as well. With the dashboard that the students are given access to, so they log on to Reading Plus, they've already finished their insight assessment, and they're given access to a dashboard which is very much personalized for them. That dashboard contains information that serves two different functions. One of the functions is to give the students personal responsibility over their own reading development, so that they feel a sense that they are in control of what they are doing. The other focus of the content of the dashboard is that the students will see extrinsic motivators to want to read. So while they're looking at that dashboard, the information that they're looking at is specific to them. Their own reading targets, their own word count targets, their own fluency targets, their own comprehension targets. Are they reading at a consistent speed? And through that dashboard, the program will communicate with them to the extent of how well they're doing. If they need any extra help, they get notifications through that dashboard. They'll also get awards through that dashboard as well. They can receive messages from us and from you guys as educators on that dashboard. There's also information on the dashboard and on the pupil account for parents and caregivers, so that if you want to get the parents involved at home, Reading Plus has information for parents to help them understand what their children are doing and how they might be able to help with that. They can also do fun things like they can change the avatars, and they get new avatars as a reward for good comprehension on the program. So it's very interactive without being too interactive, so that students are just playing on the program all the time, when in fact what we want them to do is to be reading stories and helping and developing their English. Just to say that all of the data that is produced by Reading Plus is going to be fed to an educator account, in which, as educators, you guys would be able to see all of the information that is produced. As I mentioned, question level analysis reports, projected growth reports, fluency reports, comprehension reports. You're able to see whether they're using the various tools and scaffolding in the program to the best of their ability, and you're able to intervene using that information and that data as well. We've kind of touched on this a little bit. One of the great things about the program, because of just the sheer number of stories on Reading Plus, kind of high quality nonfiction and high quality fiction stories, it's excellent at helping students develop cultural content. I've had lots of conversations with teachers in the past, especially kind of primary school teachers that are getting the SATs paper and seeing the various different stories on the SATs paper and wondering at what point that student would have been exposed to that kind of content. A couple of years ago, famously, obviously, there was that story about the tenrec, which was a porcupine from Madagascar. I'd never heard of a tenrec. I don't know anybody who had. But one of the ways that the program kind of really helps students and gives them confidence when going into a library to choose a book or going into a test and not being concerned about the content of that test is it gives them access to a vast number of stories, a vast number of subjects, a vast number of kind of cultural context for them to be able to read from. As I said, the stories on there about Lionel Messi. The stories on there about Mozart. There's stories up on there. My favorite story is a year 3 story about bananas. I used to when I lived in Taiwan, I had a banana tree in my back garden. I had absolutely no idea that a banana was a herb. I thought it was a fruit. Turns out the banana is a herb. And I learned this through reading one of the stories on a year 3 library. Because the stories are written specifically for us, the content, as it says, is deliberately and written into the story so that a student can come away from that text and they should be able to tell you 2 or 3 things that are interesting about bananas, for example, or there's a really good story about strange jobs during Victorian England. As an example, there used to be people in Victorian London whose job it was to wear very, very large, thick, woolly suits and lie in the beds of wealthy hotel, and they would warm the bed up before the customer came back to the hotel so that it was warm for them in the winter, which is something I'd also never heard of as well. So yeah, excellent at developing cultural context, and obviously you guys will know as well as I do, cultural context is is really, really important. It's imperative for them to be able to have some cultural context when answering inference questions as well. Okay, so progress tracking. Every time the students read a story, the data from that story is fed back into the educator account. And that will show you real-time data. So you'll see how many words were in the story. You'll see what the comprehension score was. You'll see how quickly they were reading. You'll see how quickly they were reading during independent reading time. You'll see what story they chose. You'll see whether it was fiction or non-fiction. All of that is fed immediately back into the program. And what that provides to you are lots of different ways that you can monitor and intervene with the students. As an example of that, the chart that you're looking at on the screen right now is a projected growth report. So let's say, for example, your students start in September and they have been reading on the program for a few months. They've been reading 5 texts a week. They've been doing a vocabulary lesson. They're making good progress. What that projected growth report will then do is show you where they are likely to be by the end of the school year if they maintain their current performance on Reading Plus. So you can look at that and say, this student who is currently working 5 years behind their chronological age is projected to be working 1 year behind their chronological age by the end of the school year, thus making 4 years of progress in that time. So not only are you looking at real-time progress, you're looking at projected growth throughout the school year. And if that student isn't making the kind of progress that you think they should be making, you can intervene early by, for example, increasing the number of lessons that they do. If they're not meeting their minimum requirements, you can get them just to meet their minimum requirements. If it's a function of low comprehension scores, for example, then you can intervene early by helping them with the paper-based interventions, or there's something on the program called a reread, which allows students to go back into text to refer to that text when answering comprehension questions. And you're able to see whether they're using that functionality on the program as well. So lots of very, very good actionable data for you as educators to make choices about what you do with the students in terms of their instruction, in terms of their reading development, both on Reading Plus, by the way, and away from Reading Plus as well. So one thing I think it's kind of worth spending a little bit of time on is the diagnostic reading assessment that students complete at the beginning of their time on Reading Plus. That diagnostic reading assessment is called Insight. What the students will do at the beginning of their time is spend between 30 and 45 minutes completing a reading assessment. As an aside, I've worked with schools in the past where the students that we are working with are, in terms of their readability, is kind of at a year two level or below. And in those instances where a diagnostic reading assessment of this kind would be too much for them, we can bypass the assessment and place them manually on the lowest levels of the program. So don't worry too much if you're thinking about some of your EAL students right now and thinking, wow, that would be way too much for them. We can bypass and do it or do it manually. But for the most part, as long as the students can read above a year two level, they would be able to access the diagnostic assessment. What that assessment will measure for your students is their comprehension and give them a year related score, their vocabulary and give them a year related score, their comprehension based reading speed, and that is a score which is given in words per minute. The program will then take those three pieces of information and give you guys as educators an overall reading proficiency score for that student. So rather than using a reading age, which I know a lot of assessments will do and a lot of schools will use, we use an overall reading proficiency score because it's a more robust measurement of their reading capabilities. You might have a student who can read in terms of the complexity of a story at a year six level, but their comprehension-based reading speed is 90 words per minute, which is the speed that you would expect somebody in year two to be reading when they're reading silently. That's common amongst EAL students. Their comprehension can be very, very good, but their fluency is not where it would normally be. What we also see with EAL students is an exaggerated gap between their vocabulary performance and their comprehension performance. What what you will find is students who are learning any additional language tend to learn a lot of vocabulary in isolation, and that doesn't always translate to being able to understand vocabulary in the context of a story or in the context of a piece of text. And this is the kind of thing that the screening report, the diagnostic reading assessment, will pick up. The report that you can see on your screen just now, this is called the screening report. Each one of those dots is a student. And in very, very simple terms, if the students populate in the green quadrant, we know they're great adept students. Their fluency and comprehension is above where they need to be for their chronological age. Students in yellow, quite a lot of EAL students populate in here, students who have good comprehension, but their fluency isn't where it needs to be. Students in the top left-hand corner, the kind of peach color, these are students that are what we used to call speed decoders when we were teaching students who could mimic very good fluency, good prosody, reading orally, sound, like fluent English readers. But if you ask them simple retrieval questions or inference questions, they struggle to answer because they haven't retained that information. And then students in red are students who are below fluency and below comprehension. Where the students place on that screening report and what their individual results are is what goes on to then decide where they are going to start their time on the program. And that's where the beginning of that computer adaptive learning starts. And from that point forward, the program will make decisions about how long they spend in libraries, how much support they need based on their insight assessment and their historical work and performance on the program. And you get this in a very, very easy to read charts so that you can see where your students are currently for their overall reading proficiency, but with comprehension, vocabulary, reading speed also broken down separately. And I think you'll find that a really powerful tool for things like Ofsted as well. When Ofsted come in and want to see your reading data, not only can you show them the results of the diagnostic reading assessment, but because it automatically takes them onto Reading Plus, you can show Ofsted exactly what work has been done to help students develop the areas that have been identified as areas that they are struggling with. So for example, if they're in this yellow quadrant and they're in fluency focus, that is explicit on the program for the educators to see that that student is working in a year four library and it's fluency that we are working on currently. So it's really, really good for when the inspectors come in and see you guys. So the guided window. The reason why this has a slide all of its own is because this is the thing that makes Reading Plus very, very different to all other reading development programs. We use a patented guided window to help students develop their fluency through consistent left to right tracking. What that means is when the students are reading on Reading Plus, initially they're going to be using that window to help them understand how quickly they should be reading and to help them track from left to right. To give you guys a little bit of history about the program was developed by optometrists. This part of the program anyway. They used laser eye tracking to look at the eye movements of 10,000 students and then built the reading portion of Reading Plus around that. This is obviously especially good for students who don't read from left to right in their first language. So for students who read Cantonese, for example, or read Chinese Mandarin, they're reading more often than not from right to left, but also from top to bottom, also from bottom to top, and sometimes from left to right. So for those students and for students who speak Arabic as a first language as well, the left to right tracking is a skill that they need to learn. With the guided window, it's going to be moving at a specific speed for each individual student. It's not an arbitrary speed based on their age or how long they've been on the program. The program is constantly assessing whether it's appropriate to increase that reading speed. It is a comprehension-based reading speed, so they can't just read quickly and then do poorly on the comprehension questions. The program wouldn't count that as a reading speed. They have to show some consistency as well. With the guided window, because it's a piece of scaffolding, the program will employ a gradual release model and very, very gradually take away that scaffolding. Initially, they'll be reading on the program with the guided window for 75% of the story. The last 25% they are reading independently. As their proficiency improves, as their overall fluency improves, as their instant recognition of high frequency words and their automaticity gradually improves, the program will reduce down the amount of time that they are exposed to that guided window down to approximately 50%. And when they are proficient readers, when their fluency is where it needs to be, so for example, for a year 7 student at 195 words per minute, the program will allow them to remove that guided window and they can read independently. As I said, it's computer adaptive learning. So if they start to struggle or become inconsistent, the program automatically reapplies that guided window. The guided window is an incredibly strong tool for increasing the comprehension-based reading speed of your readers. Something that we would be able to show to you guys if you guys ever contacted us and we went through a specific demonstration of the program with you, we'd be able to show you the kinds of gains that can be made with that guided window. Yeah, just again, yeah, I mean, just as an example, the width of that window is the visual span of a human eye while we read. All of Reading Plus has been developed and researched. Nothing on here is on here by mistake. The reason why the background is blurred out is so students can't jump in and out of sentences incomplete, which I'm sure you'll have seen yourselves as teachers. That often happens. We used to use a kind of specialized ruler to help students to learn how to read at a consistent speed. This is a digital version of that. Okay, kind of finally on the program itself. When we first kind of touched on what EAL meant, we obviously have a very, very wide range of EAL students. And one of the things that teachers talk to me about all the time is what do we do with students who are brand new to English and they're still doing phonics at school? Reading Plus is not a phonics program, it's a post-phonics reading program. But what it does have on here is 2 lessons called visual skills. And these visual skills can be used alongside a phonics program at a school. These visual skills lessons are there to help students develop the skills that they're going to need in order to kind of bridge that gap between phonics and decoding and fluent reading. So the first lesson is called Scan. By the way, both of these lessons don't involve the students having to read anything. It's just skills building. The first one, Scan, is going to help your students start to develop the skills that they need to comfortably and consistently track from left to right on a page while concentrating on the content of that page without actually having to read. Very, very powerful tool for bridging that gap between decoding and phonics and fluent reading. The second lesson on Reading Plus on the visual skills section of the program is called Flash. And that's designed to help them develop the skills that they're going to need in order to be able to develop their automaticity and instant recognition of letters and words. So again, they don't have to actually read anything while doing these lessons. All it's doing is helping them to develop. So with Flash, they're going to see trigraphs, so 3 letters, high frequency letters, appear on the screen and immediately disappear. And the students have to learn through playing with this part of the program that they need to be able to very, very quickly, instantly identify what those letters are. And by doing that, obviously they do well on the program. They get rewards and achievements, and they level up and all of that kind of thing. So I've had quite a lot of teachers in the past when I've been speaking to them, and they can say, right, Lee, I've got 25 students, and this is going to work for 23 of them, but for the other two students still doing phonics, what can we do with them? And that's where visual skills would come in. It's something to be done where students aren't yet ready to be reading year two level stories, but are at the point where they need to start bridging that gap between phonics and decoding and fluent reading instead. But the Derby Research School did a study of Reading Plus over a school year with year six students. What they did was measure their levels using a SATs paper. Half of the students used Reading Plus for a year, the other half of the students didn't use Reading Plus for a year, and then they used the end of year SATs paper to look at the progress that each of those two groups of students had made. That progress was broken down to boys and girls, SEND, pupil premium, and EAL students as well. And what that showed was that EAL students using Reading Plus made 50% more progress than the students not using Reading Plus. So those are obviously significant gains. The program is also currently being trialed by the Education Endowment Foundation, and there's quite recently there was a study done by Education Finland, a completely independent study, again showing very, very, very good progress for students who are learning English as an additional language, as obviously Finnish students would be doing. So not only am I telling you it works, the research and the studies show that it works as well. And then we have a nice little story here about how Reading Plus has positively affected Sasha's English development. I'm not going to read that to you, but just to say that it's been a positive impact for him. And not only is he learning how to read, but he's actually enjoying the stories that he is reading as well on there. From a company point of view, I don't know if any of you have had any kind of experience with reading programs before. I don't know what level of customer support that you get, but from us, you'll get a very, very high level of customer support throughout your entire time using the program. We have a dedicated team of staff here who are there to help you with training and support, not only for the school or for groups, but also for individual students. You have unlimited access to that team. There's also a wealth of documents that you can read. There are currently 1,500 schools in the United Kingdom using Reading Plus. Many, many more schools throughout the world, but in the United Kingdom, 1,500. We can also help by putting you in touch with schools that have been using the program for a while if you wanted to talk to teachers who've been using it on a daily basis for years. In many cases, the program's been in the UK for about 10 years now as well. So I know that in the past you might have had some experiences where you've had a program, you've been given it to use, and you're kind of left to your own devices. We will provide you with full training and ongoing support for your time that you're on the program. I regularly speak with schools and kind of work with them on ways of using the program in a way that maybe it wasn't necessarily designed to do, using it for whole class reading, for example, or using the writing section of the program for students to be able to read orally with teachers on one-on-one sessions and that kind of thing. Just being creative with how the program can work for different kinds of students, and that's something that you'll have access to as well. And then if you guys have been interested in what you have seen today and you wanted to give the program a try at your school, Reading Solutions offers schools a free 4-week pilot of Reading Plus, a kind of test drive of the program to look at things like student engagement and how it would fit inside your school as well.